Welcome to this Your Vote 2024 town hall from AZPM News. Election Day seems a long way off, but these discussions are a chance to get information about topics that are expected to be on the ballot. Tonight, we're talking about the minimum wage in Arizona and two proposals we all may get the chance to vote on in November. The first is a citizens initiative that would raise the minimum wage in Arizona from $14.25 to $16 in January, and then raise it by $1 a year the following 2 Januaries until it reaches $18 an hour for all workers, including those who receive tips as a regular part of their work. That issue of tips brings us to the proposal the legislature may put on the ballot, which would allow employees who receive regular tips as part of their wage to be paid up to 25% less than the minimum wage. Now, that proposal still needs one more vote in the legislature before it's put on the November ballot. If they both make the ballot and both are approved by voters, the one with the most votes will become the law in Arizona. Tonight, we have a panel of experts joining us to talk about the issue. Mariah Ross from One Fair Wage, that's the Citizens Initiative to raise the minimum wage up to $18 an hour. Dan Bogert from the Arizona Restaurant Association, which is backing the legislative proposal allowing 25% below minimum wage for some tipped workers. And Dr. Price Fishback from the University of Arizona Eller College of Management. Now, for our audience watching on Zoom, if you'd like to ask questions, please do so. Just put them in the Q&A section. Everyone, welcome to the Your Vote 2024 Town Hall. Thanks so much for joining us. Dr. Fishback, actually, I want to start with you. You have written a lot on the New Deal, which was supposed to help get us out of the recession or the depression, and you've written about labor laws. With those things in mind, how do government mandates like minimum wage help workers, or do they?
Well, so the history of these kind of things, when the first minimum wages were introduced in the teens, actually, and they were for women. The Supreme Court had struck down hours limits for men, and so they didn't even try to have minimum wages for men at the time. And they had those up until about 1923, and then the Supreme Court struck down the female minimum wage as being unconstitutional. And then things kind of reversed, and the states didn't accept this. A lot of times the states actually have led the way on the minimum wage for a long, long time. And in the early 30s, things started to have problems again, and so they all started to pass minimum wage laws. And they actually had a case where they struck the wage down again. And then in 1937, they had a case where they had the original minimum wage law from Washington in 1911, and they actually declared it was constitutional. So that opened up the door to have minimum wages from that point on. So in 1938, they had the Fair Labor Standards Act, and in that one, they actually had a national minimum wage, although they didn't cover a lot of jobs, and so they still had the minimum wages for women at the state level. And then the minimum wage peaked in real terms in 1968. The effects for men and women actually has fallen since that time. The federal wage has fallen since that time, and the states have picked up the role again here. And so a number of legislatures and also citizens initiatives or whatever have been used to increase the minimum wage in about 31 states relative to the federal minimum wage. So the predicted impacts for the minimum wage depend on what you believe about how competitive the labor market is. So if you have a competitive labor market, which seems to usually be the case for the kind of low wage workers that are being covered by the minimum wage, with a lot of employers trying to hire in that market, the usual effects that are expected are that you'd expect employment to fall for the minimum wage workers. You expect for the people who keep their jobs, their wage goes up. And oftentimes hours get cut in that kind of situation as well. Another thing that can happen during that period is that the requirements for getting a job start to go up. And so you might see more discrimination in these kind of cases. Most of the findings when they look at the low wage workers themselves, you see this increase in unemployment among that group, reduction in hours, but the group that gets the minimum wage are actually better off. And so it's a trade-off basically that's going on between, how do you help the people who no longer can get the job versus, and then the benefits that you get for these other people. And so, and now there's an alternative view, and that is that you have a labor market where there are relatively few employers, and so they have kind of a monopolistic power is the term that they use. It's kind of like monopoly on the buyer side. Then actually the minimum wage can actually lead to increased employment. And so it becomes a really important situation to look at what is the context in which you're trying to pass the wage.
Mariah, let me turn to you and the One Fair Wage Act. As I said, when we open this is stepped up to $18 over a couple of years, assuming that the voters approve it. Right now, we're at $14.25 in Arizona. How'd you pick the numbers to get up to 18? What's the magic of those numbers?
Yeah, first I'd like to start off by saying I'm glad we're starting with history and that we frame the history of minimum wage, but also we need to frame the history of sub-minimum wages. Sub-minimum wages are a direct legacy of slavery, unfortunately, in this country. And that's why we believe in the One Fair Wage Act, because everyone deserves a living wage, regardless of their background. As we were talking about low wage workers and their backgrounds, it is mostly people of color and youth. And so all people of color and all youth deserve to have a living wage. As for why 18, so according to MIT's living wage calculator, that is the necessary living wage in Arizona. And then we also did a survey and some polls within the state, and that is what Arizonians want. That's what they need to be able to get by as a single adult to fit their basic needs. This isn't a lavish salary. It's not a lavish hourly pay or anything like that. It's basic needs for a single adult with no dependents, no children, to be able to feed themselves, house themselves, and transport themselves to and from work, which I feel like are rights that every American and every Arizonian deserve, especially if they're working a full-time job and working 40 plus hours a week, or sometimes working 2 to 3 jobs just to barely get by.
And Dan, let me turn to you on the bill or the resolution that's moving through the legislature that the Restaurant Association is backing, that would allow basically something similar to what we have now. Wait staff, people who generally get tips as a part of their wage, can be paid a lower than the minimum wage right now. The one that you all are backing would put that at 25%. So why pay those folks, and in your case, restaurants, your wait staff, your bartenders, stuff like, why continue to pay them under minimum wage? What's the argument?
Well, first of all, thank you Charlie for having us. I just want to clarify one thing. There is no such thing as a sub-minimum wage. It is illegal for someone to make less than the minimum wage under all circumstances in the state of Arizona. So what we're talking about here is a tip credit, and it allows the employer to credit a portion of the tips received by the employees towards meeting that minimum wage obligation. And so the proposal that's in front of the legislature right now is to allow for a 25% tip credit, but it also guarantees a higher guarantee take home to the worker. So under the proposal in front of the legislature, it'd be a 25% tip credit. However, the employer would have to guarantee that tipped employee made at least $2 above whatever the minimum wage ends up being. So ours doesn't touch the minimum wage. It doesn't limit the minimum wage. It just protects the very crucial tip credit to the industry and to our employees. And why is that important? It's important because if we look at jurisdictions that have eliminated the tip credit, they actually have a lower tip percentage to their employees. So we're hurting the businesses that have higher mandatory obligations. It's hurting the servers who get a lower tip percentage on those bills. And it's hurting the consumers who see higher prices in the forms of higher menu prices and mandatory service charges to make up for those differences. By keeping the tipping model, we are allowing consumers to express their appreciation for quality service in the restaurant space by leaving a tip. That server is able to collect that full dollar amount. It is the property of that server. It is against the law for the restaurant to retain any ownership of that. And the benefit of that is tips are not taxed at the sales tax level or the business income tax level. If we shift that revenue into higher menu prices and service charges, that same consumer dollar has a larger percentage that goes to not the business, not the server, but it goes to the government. And so that's why we think it's important to protect the tip credit and protect the tipping culture and revenue streams in the restaurant industry.
Let me make sure I understand and our viewers understand. So as you said, right now, Arizona law has the minimum wage at $14.25 an hour, and then says for workers who receive tips as a regular part of their wage, they can be paid at a lower rate. And then this new proposal says 25% less unless you're below the minimum wage, and then the restaurant, I guess, would have to make up the difference if your tips don't make up the difference. Am I understanding that correctly?
That's roughly correct. The current law, there's a $3 tip credit in Arizona law. So right now, an employer can take a $3 tip credit, but the employee is still guaranteed to make the full minimum wage. Now, I'll tell you, Charlie, I've never run into a situation where a tipped worker has not been able to make up that difference. The average tipped worker makes in the United States of America makes a little bit over $27 an hour. So when we're talking about this, it's a very small subset of workers that might fall into that. But the employer still has to guarantee under current law that they make the minimum wage. Under our proposal, we would guarantee them minimum wage plus $2. Otherwise, the employer could no longer access the tip credit.
So I have to.
Mariah, oh, yes, Mariah, go ahead. I was going to ask you a question, but go ahead.
I just have to make a few point of clarities as well, because first off, Dan, I'm very disheartened to hear that you want to continue the history of tipping. As I just said, it is rooted deeply in slavery and is a legacy of slavery. So I'm sorry that you want to continue that practice. But as for the term sub minimum wage, sub means below, minimum means bare minimum that you can pay a person. And a restaurant, the base pay that they pay coming out of the restaurant's expenses would be below the sub minimum wage, below the minimum wage, and therefore is a sub minimum wage. Anyone who has to get paid from a business less than minimum wage is making a sub minimum wage, but especially tipped workers whose base currently is $3 less and could be even far less after you change it to a percentage to 25%, because instead of $3 less, it can be almost $4 less instead. So your solution to workers not making enough money right now is to pay them even less. And as for that number, that statistic that you just named, that is from an internal survey that the Restaurant Association does nationally. And that is not the real number from the Department of Labor statistics, according to the United States government. So I prefer to look at actual statistics that aren't internal surveys, national surveys at that, not reflective of the situation here in Arizona. And then also saying that businesses are going to make less revenue, tips are going to go down. Unfortunately, that's not the case, because if we look to our neighbors, if we look to Nevada and if we look to California, their small businesses make more in revenue. Their restaurants generate more revenue. The tips are higher there. So telling workers that instead of, voting to raise wages to $18 plus tips, instead, hey, let's lower your pay. That's not a solution for the housing crisis. That's not a solution for the food prices going up and Arizonians not being able to afford to live. Workers, especially restaurant workers and tip workers, they deserve a fair pay. And we cannot continue with a legacy of slavery. Unfortunately, that's not good enough. We have to do better. This is 2024.
Charlie, I got to jump in here.
Well, go ahead, Dan. I was going to say
linking this to slavery is a cheap move. I mean, first of all, tipping originated in Europe. So let's move on a little bit here from that. But second of all, I want to point out a couple of things.
People to move on.
Hang on, Mariah. Let's let Dan finish.
That's just not acceptable.
Mariah, let's let Dan finish.
Yeah.
The other thing I wanted to address here is this idea that Restaurants in states that don't have a tip credit bringing in more revenue is somehow proof that they're doing better. They're generating more revenue because their prices are higher to adjust for that. What you have to look at in order to figure out the compensation of the employee is the tip percentages, and those are down. And in terms of the Department of Labor statistics that Mariah cited, I agree with you. Those statistics don't line up, but you also have to read the disclaimers. They do not capture all of the tipped revenue that comes to those employees. So you're talking about apples and oranges when we're talking about that.
And
I do have to-
I looked at the
minimum, just really quick, the minimum wage, yes, originated in feudal Europe. And then when it got to the US, it was changed and it was made more malicious. In Europe, it was a wage plus tips, but it was the same wage that everyone else made plus tips. Tips were as a bonus, it was an add-on. And when it came to the United States, right after emancipation, unfortunately, it became much more malicious. And there were two industries. One, the Pullman Train Company, who hired 10,000 newly freed Black men as porters, named them all George, and paid them tips. Yes, that was the first industry, but the second industry that did that was the restaurant industry with Black women. So no, we cannot move on when there's still a racial income gap, when there's still a gender income gap, when Black women and women of color are still the main people working in restaurants almost, over 100 years later. So no, unfortunately, we cannot move on, Dan, until everyone is paid a fair wage and everyone has a livable wage, especially the women and the women of color who are working hard to help support their families.
Let's get Dr. Fishback in on this as a bit of a historian. I don't know how much background you've got on the long history of tipping and minimum wage.
I don't know that much about. I don't know that much about the tipping history. I'm kind of confused about the tipping in slavery because there was no tipping in slavery. So you're suggesting that this is afterwards, and so tipping did become something that was a way to make money. I don't know what the actual levels of the incomes were and things along those lines. I do want to point out that one issue that does pop up with the minimum wage is that there seems to be evidence that discrimination actually increases as a result of the minimum wage because you've got a pool of people who want the job, and that means the employer or the fellow workers can choose who they like. And as a result, you may actually have a negative effect where you actually might have more discrimination than you did before. There is a discussion by economists in a lot of these different situations where they suggest that the kind of things that Mariah is talking about are things like where you really want to have people with families and things like that earn more. One of the suggestions has been as a more effective way of doing it is to do it through the earned income tax credit. Because the earned income tax credit actually is targeted at people with families, and it actually targets a poverty group rather than the group that often is in the minimum wage includes a lot of workers who are secondary or third workers who actually live in a household where other people are the primary earners. And so the minimum wage actually could create some problems for people trying to achieve those goals. The earned income tax credit actually helps alleviate that problem. It seems to be a more efficient way of helping people particularly families, get to a higher level of income.
Talking about things like the earned income tax credit versus minimum wage is something that was brought up. We have different minimum wages in different states. Looking according to the federal government right now, just looking at the 4 states that border us, we go from Utah at $7.25 an hour, which is the federal minimum, unless someone's covered by the Fair Labor Standards Act, up to California, which is $16 an hour. Nevada has 2 minimum wages, $11.25 an hour if there are no health benefits, and then it's $10.25 if the employee is eligible for health benefits. And New Mexico comes in at $12, and we're at $14.25 right now. From an economic standpoint, an economist standpoint, how does this play out when you have 5 states, counting Arizona, that all are one region, and they're all paying different wages? How does all that play out economically, Dr. Fishback?
Well, so I think that the issue there is actually So like there are 31 states that have actually passed minimum wages that are higher than the federal standard. And the federal standard is the Fair Labor Standards Act. That's the 725. And so that wage is egregiously low. As I think I mentioned this before, that in real terms, the $7.25 wage, which is the federal wage, is equivalent to the 1954 minimum wage or the 1952 minimum wage in purchasing power. So that's egregiously low, which is why the states have actually come in and started to do this kind of thing. And so Arizona ranks, I think it's 10th in terms of the minimum wage. So the people above it are Washington, D.C., state of Washington is at 1628, California and New York are at 16. That's New York City. The rest of New York is at 15. Connecticut is at 1569, New Jersey 1513, Maryland 15, Massachusetts 15, Colorado is 1442, so they're reasonably close by. The context for this is that Arizona actually has a relatively high minimum wage relative to its cost of living. So the cost of living in DC, Washington, DC is like 18% higher than it is in Arizona. In Washington, it's about 13% higher. California and New York, it's 11% higher. So that we're actually kind of unusual in the sense that we rank like about, let's see, 17th in average salary, 10th in the minimum wage, and we're 22nd in terms of the cost of living. And so one of the questions you might want to ask is, well, can we afford to move up that way? The big question there is, to what extent are these businesses that are paying the minimum wage competing with businesses in other states for business? Because the restaurant industry tends to compete locally. So it's probably not affecting things so much across state lines. But if you have people who are working in jobs where they're producing products that are sold in national markets, then it creates more problems for the producer and also for the worker to some extent in Arizona in that kind of situation.
So let me remind all of our viewers here, if you want to ask a question, go ahead and put it in the Q&A. So Mariah, kind of following up on something Dr. Fishback said, and a question that often comes up with the increase of minimum wage is, how do businesses, especially small businesses, not necessarily big corporate America businesses, how do they offset the raise that they're going to have to give to workers with their bottom lines?
Luckily, we don't have to hypothesize. We're not reinventing the wheel, right? Having a living wage with tips on top and no sub minimum wages for certain classes of people. There are 7 other states that do not have a sub minimum wage. And so we see restaurants there are still thriving. They still have high revenue percentages. They still have high tipping percentages and actual tips. And at the end of the day, what they usually do, just like when cost of goods go up, like if the cost of eggs increase at a restaurant, for example, or their rent goes up, they pivot. They do various other things. They add new items to the menu. Sometimes they have to increase the menu price just a little bit, right? But if you can do that for cost of goods increasing, right, you should be able to do the same thing to pay the hardworking people working in your restaurant to make your business a success, a living wage. So people are just as important as goods, just as important as your rent cost, just as important as your utility bill at the restaurant. And all of these things go up. Inflation has been going up a lot. We all can agree on that. And so, yes, costs have gone up for many restaurants, and labor costs need to go up as well, because people, as I said, who are working full time at these restaurants and at other businesses cannot afford to live due to the current rise in inflation. After COVID happened, we saw many workers leave the workforce, and a lot of them haven't come back, mostly due to low wages, due to the treatment that they received at that workplace, because this industry is #1 for harassment, #1 for wage theft. And for voters this year, but especially for Black voters, for Latino voters, and for young voters, this issue is the #1 issue. It's jobs to pay a living wage, and it's the economy and the rising cost of living and inflation. If this wasn't an issue, if everyone was great and people could afford to live in Arizona, this would not be the top issue amongst voters' minds this year. And
So why, if it's the top issue, why wait 3 years to step it to 18 and cover everybody? Because the proposal says it goes to, assuming it passes again in November. In January, it goes to 16, but the rules are still the rules for tipped workers. January, the next January, it would be 17, but again, the rules stay the rules for tipped workers. It's not until the third year that it goes to 18 and tipped workers then get included in that. Why not just say January 1, 2025, which used to sound like a long time away, but now is so soon. That's it. Tipped workers are now included. Why wait almost 3 years to step that in?
So we believe in an incremental increase for a period of time to allow people to adjust, to allow businesses to adjust, because we want to support small businesses long term. By raising wages, it's going to increase retention rates. It's going to increase morale. It's going to increase performance. And so that is why we allow that period of time. It's for small businesses to adjust slowly, to alter their business plans, to adjust for these costs. We're not trying to shock the market. We're not trying to do that. We're trying to do this in a stable way that works for workers and for businesses.
We've got a couple of questions that have come in from our audience. And again, if you're an audience member and you want to ask a question, go ahead and put it in the Q&A and we'll get to them. The first one says, and Dan, this is going to be your part of the world, I believe. It says, are tips given solely to the server? Do kitchen staff, people who bust the tables, et cetera, share in those tips? If not, how does this proposal relate to staff other than the specific table server?
Great question. There is something called a tip pool, which is where all of tipped employees put a percentage or all of their tips into a tip pool, and then it's distributed back out to those tipped workers. That's all governed by federal rule. So it prevents any type of supervisor or owner, or anyone like that from participating in that tip pool. There's rules governing how that tip pool has to be set up. But regardless, under the law, that tip dollar is the property of the employee. It just depends on which employee it's going to, busser, server, et cetera. And that can be dealt with in a tip pool scenario.
Are all restaurants, if I open up the AZPM Your Vote 2024 cafe tomorrow and I hire my staff and my wait staff is tipped, am I required to do a tip pool, or is that up to individual owners, whether they want the wait staff just to keep the tips or they want it for the folks making the food and bussing the tables and all the other things that make a restaurant run?
So Charlie, there's no requirement that a tip pool be implemented. There's just requirements for how a tip pool would have to run if one is implemented.
Okay. We have another question from Kathleen, one of our viewers tonight. She said, I've read that the recent increase in the minimum wage that Arizona implemented over the last several years did not result in job losses. There were definitely arguments by lower wage industry representatives that the proposed minimum wage increases would cause lower income workers to lose jobs, but that doesn't seem to have played out. Can Dr. Fishback comment on the recent history in Arizona?
I don't know the specifics about Arizona. I can tell them where the results of the analysis came from economists. And so what they've done is that they've looked at, there have probably been about 100 studies or maybe 150 studies done in the last 25 or 30 years about the minimum wage. What they did was they looked at all these various changes in the state wages over the course of time and tried to look at what was going on and tried to hold constant everything else. Because the argument for about job loss is that everything else is held constant. And so if the state like Arizona, which is growing during the migration and a lot of in-migration and things like that, businesses have been growing in Arizona. And so you could get the growth of the businesses would offset any job losses that would come about because of the minimum wage. So the typical effect that's suggested is, say you had like a 10% increase in the minimum wage, that would end up leading to about a 1% drop in employment or hours worked, somewhere in that neighborhood. That's what the elasticity comes up with. Now that's holding everything else constant, right? And so that's very important to take into account. There have been some studies that find zero effect there. And so it just depends on the study, depends on the context. There's been some discussion among economists about the minimum wage in terms of this idea about monopsony versus competition. For where the minimum wage is sitting, though, in most of these cases, it looks like that these are jobs where a lot of businesses are hiring people in these same markets. So it seems likely it's a competitive market and these effects would occur. You know, but in general, however, this is the result of a large number of different events and looking at the combination of all those different events. There are going to be different situations that show up. These are averages in these various cases. So,
Mariah, let me ask you a question about minimum wage. And for a second, let's put the tipped worker part of this aside and talk about the other minimum wage workers. We recently did a series here at AZPM called Where to Live, and it was about housing and homelessness. And one of the women we met who's living in a shelter is making minimum wage right now, working darn near full time, but she can't afford to pay her rent because her rent is going up. Is at the end of the day, is 18 going to be enough? And again, setting aside for a moment the restaurant workers, but for all the other, she was working at a convenience store, but there are lots of other workers who make minimum wage.
Yeah, we have done a survey and we think that this will affect over 1 million Arizonian workers. And we see the housing crisis happening and getting worse every day. And so is 18 enough? That's a very good question. And we believe it's a starting point. It depends, of course, inflation rates is if they're going to continue to go up at the rates they've been going up. Are they going to decrease? Are they going to become steady? I mean, it's a lot of factors. It also depends on the geographic area a person lives in. But what we know for sure, according to MIT, any county, any legislative district in Arizona, 18 is the bare minimum. It's the bare minimum. It's not to live in a mansion. It's not to live in the best neighborhood in the city, but it's the bare minimum for people to be able to pay the very basic necessities, a studio and afford food and transportation. So I don't believe that 18 is enough, especially for families, because a lot of people who do have families do make minimum wage. But I do believe it is a starting point.
Let me follow up here with a question that just came in from Tony, one of our viewers. Again, assuming that the One Fair Wage Act passes and the minimum wage eventually goes to $18 an hour, do things stop at 18? Do we have to go through this process again, or does it continue to increase $1 a year? I hate to say forever, but for a long time.
Yeah, so right after the 3-year period, then it will go back to being indexed to inflation as it currently is. Of course, inflation has gotten worse, especially after the pandemic. And so hopefully, I'm sure we all hope this, things will stabilize and then we won't have to go through this again. But it really depends. It depends on what the future holds.
So I actually did some
ahead,
calculations on this. So currently, the current law is also based on inflation, as Mariah just pointed out. And so by 2028, if you'd had 2% inflation and used the current law, you'd be at 1553 in 2028. If you had 3% inflation, you'd be at 16. And if you wanted to get to 18, you'd have to have about 5.8% inflation per year for over the next 4 years. So now one thing about the CPI, the Consumer Price Index, there have been studies that were done in the late 1990s where they thought that the inflation rates from the CPI tended to overestimate the rise in the costs by about 1% a year. I'm somewhat uncertain about that, but I've seen those statistics. One of the things they suggest is that the CPI doesn't take into account enough the quality of the products moving up and things like that. and also people shifting the patterns of how they do. So the 18% is basically going to raise the wage rate about 5.8% per year up through 2028. And the current wage will do whatever the inflation rate is. It's going to take it to that level, to whatever level it goes based on the inflation rate.
Charlie, I have a quick question, if you don't mind. I've heard that the one fair wage proposal is going to take us to $18 an hour. The one that's listed on the Secretary of State's website that's being circulated doesn't list a dollar amount. It just says $1 in addition to the CPI increase. Am I missing something? Because we're telling everybody that it's going to be $18 an hour, but the bill doesn't say that.
Yes, it's based on the current incremental increase rates that's been happening based on Arizona's history, and then $1 added to that. So you're correct.
Okay, thanks for correcting that, Mariah and Dan. And Dan, let me ask you a question just so people get an understanding of how a restaurant functions. For most of us, we see the wait staff, maybe we see a bartender, maybe we see someone who's bussing a table. Maybe we see somebody who greets us at the door and gets us seated. For the average restaurant, again, we'll talk about the AZPM Your Vote 2024 cafe that apparently I'm possibly opening tomorrow. How many, for the average restaurant, how many percentage-wise employees necessarily are receiving tips versus those who are not receiving tips and are governed by the non-tip minimum wage?
Sure, it's going to completely depend on what type of restaurant you are to answer that question. But to give you an idea, we see tip hours. So if you're talking about a full service restaurant, which is where tipped employees are generally located, we're seeing tipped hours that are anywhere between 514 hours a month. And those are tipped hours that are worked. So in terms of what percentage are back of the house versus front of the house employees, which is kind of how we think about it, it's going to completely depend on your business model. You know, a sushi restaurant's going to have a different ratio than a steakhouse to an Applebee's, et cetera. So I don't think there's a good average of the percentage there. But one thing I did just want to point out that I think Mariah brought up that, you know, eliminating the tip credit would lead to higher retention and that it leads to higher tips. Again, our data doesn't show that. If we look at those jurisdictions that have eliminated the tip credit, we see a lower tip percentage. California is close to 17.5%, while Arizona servers enjoy about a 20% tip on those bills. And all we have to do is look at Washington, D.C., which is the most recent success that One Fair Wage had in eliminating the tip credit. Their tip credit hasn't even fully been eliminated yet, and they saw a 12% reduction in their workforce in the spring of this year. So I'm not sure how that leads to retention with a 12% layoff occurring.
I'm so happy
Workforce.
because, again, I like to use statistics and facts from unbiased sources when possible. And according to most studies and most reports out of DC after 1 year after the passage, we've seen 10% more restaurants open, 7% more restaurant jobs, and 6.8% higher earnings, including tips. So better wages, better tips in DC. But we don't only have to reference DC because, again, we are not reinventing the wheel here. We can look to the neighbors of Arizona. We can look to Nevada. We can look to California, where, again, better wages, better tips. So I could also
ask,
six.
Mariah, Dan said his stats came from restaurant associations and things like that. And you said you had other stats. Oh, no. Sorry, Dan,
the stat I cited from Washington, D.C., just to clarify, to make sure that we're all talking about this, is actually from several newspaper articles written about the situation in Washington, D.C. And they use a combination of doing interviews and also using Department of Labor statistics. So those are not internal ARA statistics. I just want to make that clear.
So
I could also
Mariah, just to clarify, Mariah, where are you pulling your stats from? Just so
Department of Labor Statistics, also other articles such as the New York Times, and various other sources. So we use similar things, but like I said, Department of Labor Statistics is what we mainly use for our numbers and our survey results. When we survey people, especially when we do our own internal surveys, we also like to use unbiased base data. And I could also cite articles from publications, like I said, New York Times, and other publications in DC have also talked about the increased tipping percentage and how the sky isn't falling as we like to imagine is going to happen once we do this. It's actually the ceiling is rising. So
One of the things, go ahead, Dan.
So Charlie, I just say, I think all you have to do to look at this is in all of their jurisdictions where One for Wages run this, you see a massive upswelling of tipped workers who fight against it. And we're seeing that same thing here in Arizona because they understand the reality. Servers talk to each other. And the situation that's occurring in Washington, D.C. right now, I'm not sure which articles Mariah is talking about where we're seeing increased tip percentages. That's not what we're seeing in Washington, D.C. at all. What we're seeing is the entire compensation model for servers has changed to where the restaurant has been forced to charge a mandatory service charge or drastically increase their menu prices. And then what they're doing to compensate their employees, in addition to the wage that they're paying them, is they're saying, hey, we're going to give you a percentage of sales. And so employees are chasing percentages in additional tipped revenue. One thing to point out on this, a statistic, a Department of Agriculture statistic, consumers spend 5% of their disposable income at restaurants. And that statistic has been steady since 1962. Okay. Again, the major benefit of tipping is that you don't have to pay sales tax on it when you tip a server. You don't have to have the business pay business income tax on it before they turn around and pay the server. The biggest winner on the elimination of the tip credit is the government. Everyone else, the business, the server, the consumer loses.
There's an interesting follow-up that's come out of the audience here. Lou has a question. Actually, it's a two-parter because he followed up on his own question. And it goes to what the two of you were talking about and also something that Dr. Fishback mentioned. And Lou says, when the minimum wage rises to $18, won't prices rise to make up for the difference, therefore contributing to inflation? And he followed up by saying specifically for small businesses, and he's not necessarily talking about restaurants in this case, but again, all those other businesses that fall under, well, all businesses fall under minimum wage, but the ones that are paying minimum wage. So Mariah, I'll let you jump on that first.
Yeah, so inflation's already happening. It happened last year, it happened this year. There's no direct correlation between minimum wage going up and inflation going up. Actually, us trying to increase the minimum wage is in response to the high inflation rates. I don't know what workers that Dan is talking to, but we talk to workers too. And we are also a membership-based organization, but instead of restaurants, we are a worker-based organization. And you can ask any Arizonian worker who's making minimum wage, hey, is that enough for you? Do you need more money to get by? Do you need a higher pay? And they will tell you, yes. Yes, I do. It's not sustainable. It's not livable. And so we talk to real workers, real people in every state, even before we begin the process to do an initiative like what we're doing. We do it based on need and want from the people who are on the ground working these jobs. And so I would say that no, there's no direct correlation between minimum wage and inflation.
Let me go ahead.
Say something about this. So there have been some studies about the extent to which prices are passed on. It depends very strongly on what the demand is for the product and how easy it is to pass it on. So there are probably not nearly as many studies about employment as there are about this issue about passing prices on. And it seems like that there are some slight rises that go with it, but it's not as clear how well they can pass the prices on in those situations. But there's probably some rise, just as Mariah pointed out earlier, there's going to be some rise because if you raise the price of cheese, then you're probably gonna have to raise the price of cheeseburgers. So if you're raising the price of labor, you're probably gonna have to raise the price of the product as well.
But to restate, inflation's already happening if we raise the wage or not.
This is something in addition to the existing inflation, Mariah. This is something that's on top of the inflation that you're talking about.
As you just said yourself, probably. And so there's no direct correlation to minimum wage and inflation because probably is not a fact.
Well, but you don't have a fact there either in this situation. So the point is that if there's inflation already, and then you add more to the inflation, then that's additional inflation on top of what you talked about before.
Not necessarily.
Yes, it is. It's by definition, it's mechanical.
Not if inflation went down that year. That's not necessarily true. Again, we're not reinventing.
No, that's not right,
We're
Mariah.
not.
You're
We're
wrong.
not reinventing the wheel here.
You're flat
We're-
out wrong on this.
We're not
If you
reinventing.
have,
I have to
if
say
you
that
have part, let me finish. Let me
you're
finish. and
cutting
then-
me off. And earlier
No,
when I
you cut me off
when
before.
I was
All right,
talking
let's-
to
Now
him,
let's stop. Okay.
I was
Let me-
talking first. No, don't talk to me like that. Do not speak to me like that.
Hang on,
speak to
hang
me
on.
like
I was
that either.
talking-
Mariah, hang on. Mariah, go ahead, and then we'll come back to you, Dr. Fishback. We're not talking over each other.
Thank you.
Mariah, go ahead.
So as I was saying, there is no direct correlation. That is simply the fact of the matter. At the end of the day, inflation happens every year, regardless of a pay increase or not. And if you go and you ask workers, hey, are you making enough currently based on the current cost of living? They're going to tell you, no, we're not. So I'm gonna stop it there, but that's the fact of the matter.
So
All
my
right, Dr.
point is the
Fishback, I'll let
following.
you jump in.
My point is the following, that if you have an inflation rate of say 2%, and it's going to be 2% this next year as well, due to other factors, if you add on the minimum wage and they pass higher prices on, then the inflation rate is going to go up and it'd be higher than it was before. And so it's going to make the problem even worse for the people who are trying to spend the money. That's a mechanical factor. And so you can't argue against that because that's just a fact. It's a mechanical feature that goes along with that feature. So anyway, the main point about this is, look, I'm not disagreeing that people are having trouble living at $14.35 an hour. That makes perfect sense. That only gives you about $27,000 a year. And so if you're trying to run a household on that and you're the primary wage earner, that's a very difficult prospect. Okay. And so now one good thing is if you are making that, you're also eligible for the earned income tax credit, which actually does help raise your earnings some more. And so a lot of people believe that the earned income tax credit actually is a more effective way because you have different types of workers who are working. There are workers who are the primary breadwinner and they may have 0 kids or 1 kid or things like this. There are also workers who are 16-year-olds and 18-year-olds and people who are going to school and doing this part-time and doing all sorts of things along those lines and trying to get some additional learning and work experience in these kind of contexts. And so the earned income tax credit is much more effective because it targets the very people who have kids and things like that. Whereas the minimum wage is a situation where you have a lot of people who are not the primary wage earner and who are kids in a lot of cases. So
That's not, only 33%, only 33% are people 25 and under who earn the minimum wage. So that is not true.
Let me ask something, Dr. Fishback. When it comes to minimum wage, and if I remember what you said kind of at the beginning of all this with the history of it, it was supposed to be a minimum wage so that the earner of the minimum wage could live. And we all agree that $14.35 you can't look at and live on, at least in Arizona. Mariah, you said your research showed $18 an hour is where we need to get to, but that's in a couple of years. Is minimum wage anymore, Dr. Fishback, a livable wage? There was a study done in 2022. So granted, before this latest round of inflation kicked in, we have to talk about something 2 years old by the Women's Foundation of Arizona. And they said for a single parent with 2 kids, preschool age and a grade school age child, that in order to meet basic needs for no government assistance, that single parent would have to make $29.89, very often a woman in this case, and that works out to $63,000 a year. So is it possible, Dr. Fishback, do you think, to ever get the minimum wage to catch up for a family anymore, or is minimum wage, it's no longer, or maybe never could be livable given inflation and all those things that we don't know about in the future, how high or how low inflation will go in the future?
So the minimum wage has always been substantially below the median earnings in a society. They're just trying to put a very low, trying to put some kind of base that's below which you can't live. Now, so there are ways to live at $27,000 a year if you're an adult living on your own. You live with roommates and you do a variety of different things. You may stay at home and live with your parents. You may do all sorts of things to try to adjust. So that a lot of times when they talk about the minimum wage in other countries and stuff, they'll put it at 50 to 60% of the median wage in a lot of cases along those lines. And so the minimum wage, I mean, not a huge number of people in the economy are actually living at the minimum or earning the minimum wage and actually running a household on their own. And so what you're trying to do is you're trying to make sure that at the very bottom or wherever you're actually trying to take care of people there. But that's where the earned income tax credit helps in these kind of contexts. And so the minimum wage can be both positive and can be negative as well. So all these things have problems. I mean, no matter what you do, you're going to run into problems with these kind of things. Because if you raise it enough, then prices go way up and then you start to cut of employment dramatically. Because there's a reason why the minimum wage is not $25 an hour. Because if you get $25 an hour, then you'd have to raise prices enough to do all sorts of things. And so it's not going to work all that well. I mean, it's reasonable to have a minimum wage. And as I pointed out, the federal minimum wage is a joke. I mean, it's ridiculous. And there are 15 states or 17 states that are still using that as their base. And so Arizona has actually been pretty forward-looking in the sense in that they're at 1435. And so they're ranked about 9th or 10th in terms of the minimum wages around the country.
You might know this, or Mariah and Dan, you may know this also. When it comes to setting minimum wage, obviously has to be done by government. A business can pay as above the minimum wage, however much they choose to pay. It's up to them to figure out how to do it above the minimum wage. But how often now do we have to go with things like the One Fair Wage Act, which is working in a number of states as a citizens initiative, versus getting a government body, be it a legislature, county board of supervisors, Congress, to do something? Is minimum wage now really in the hands of voters historically, or looking forward, or does government tend to set it more often?
I think it's kind of a mixture. So most of the time the legislatures do it. So most of the work that I've done in the early 20th century to look at these kind of things, typically what would happen is that you would have reformers who would want to make this move. So like Mariah is a reformer who wants to make this move, and she would press the legislature to do something along these lines. But a lot of times what happens is it wasn't going to go very far unless you could get employers to agree that this is a reasonable thing. And so a lot of the labor laws that got passed, or whatever, what happened was the reformers and the new employers negotiated and ended up in a kind of a compromise type situation where they both could live with it in that kind of context. And so typically that's what happens in the legislatures now. And then you have some situations where you go to the voters, and then but the voters, you get moves over here, but you also get the legislatures doing. So I would say, based on just looking at the stuff, it's probably 50-50 as to whether the legislature did it or it went through a voting referendum.
And let's not just limit it to the legislator or the voters. There's also organizations like the Restaurant Association who lobbies the government, spends a lot of money to do so. And instead of letting the people decide on an initiative, for example, like ours, then goes and lobbies to get another piece of legislation put on the ballot, like what's currently.
Well, but that's still the people deciding. At the end of the day, the people will still decide on that, assuming it makes the ballot.
I'm saying we can't leave out the other third-party groups, such as the restaurant.
Of course, no, that's what I'm saying. So that, I mean, the employers, well, the Restaurant Association is primarily employers in this context. And so what you get is a lot of times what happened is you have employers who are kind of leading the way. And if they're leading the way and they're willing to do it, then what they do is they support the minimum wage. And then what the reformers agreed to the whatever minimum wage they set in this, because then they can get everybody in the whole society is covered by the minimum wage rather than just the leading employers doing what's going on.
Mhm.
And so that has typically been the pattern that you see, is that at the federal level and at the state level, you see the minimum wage going up. It goes up, right? And then inflation eats away at it. All right. And then it goes, so then the real version of it, or the real dollar amount of it, goes down. And then eventually what happens is that you get another move to increase it. Now, these days, what they've been doing is adding indexing to it. And so like the Arizona law is indexed to the rate of inflation. And Mariah's situation is also indexed to the rate of inflation after 2028.
So as we wrap this up, we've managed to get through just about our hour. Just to check on things, Mariah, you all are still collecting signatures. Signatures are due the beginning of July, correct?
Yep, July 3rd.
All right, and Dan, the proposal in the legislature that deals with tipped workers, we still need one more vote there to find out if that one's going to make the ballot, correct?
Correct.
All right, well, our viewers are armed with knowledge, and we will
I apologize
probably
to
talk to
Mariah
all
for overtalking her. So
yeah, and we will probably talk to all of you, assuming these make the ballot again. Once we find out what's on and off the ballot. I want to thank the three of you for your time, and I want to thank our viewers for their time and their questions. We really, really appreciate it. So thanks so much for joining us for this Your Vote 2024 Town Hall. If you want to view all of our town halls and keep up with all of the election news, make sure to visit the Your Vote 2024 section of our website, news.azpm.org. I'm Christopher Conover. Thanks for joining us.